problems facing New Zealand's primary sector have been mounting at a rapid pace. So I think it's time for open hearts and open minds. Nā mai, haere mai, and welcome to Sarah's Country. It is, of course, Māori Language Week, and I do love to try. I do have to back that up, and I will tell you a story very shortly. It's Te Reo, our native language here in New Zealand. And of course, if those who are watching around the world have missed the debate, the Māori Party have come out wanting Aotearoa to be our official name of our country by 2026, and all Pākehā names throughout our entire country to be used of the Māori names, the former Māori name. Sarah's whenua would become Sarah's Country. Now, I'm your host, Sarah Perriam, and you're set for another in-depth episode on the matters that matter most to those that wake up every single day and produce the fine food and fibre that we do out of this beautiful country called Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, I would love to associate a few words throughout tonight to celebrate Māori Language Week, because I have to admit, I grew up in a sheltered South Island Pākehā family in a school environment that we didn't have the compulsory te reo. And where did it leave me? You know, there's an economic debate that speaking the language won't get you anywhere in the world, etc., because we're the only people that speak it, etc., etc. So I want to ask you, kai parā, our farmers, or our kaitiaki, our guardians of this land, what your thoughts are around embracing more and more of te reo within our language, within our sector. We have heard a lot about te taiao, the concept with which our food and fibre vision for Aotearoa will be. I mean, I'm going to admit 100% it is an absolute challenge. I didn't grow up with it, yet I know that probably a lot of our older generation that watch Sarah's Country will be in the same boat. But have we come far enough? I'd love to hear in the comments below. Do you believe that we should make te reo compulsory within our primary schools in particular? But what I would really like, okay, I need to explain the situation to explain where I'm coming from. You know, say for instance, if you're a singer and you have that nightmare that you're going to go out on stage and open your mouth and you can't sing, the words won't come out. One of my biggest fears was as an MC, emceeing a lot of events within the primary sector here in New Zealand. I absolutely love it. Is the ongoing pressure for me to speak in te reo in my openings and understand it, and particularly introducing people. But it's a big struggle for me, and that I would come out and I wouldn't be able to announce a thing. Well, it happened in front of 700 people. I had 3 individual Māori leaders within the industry that I had to introduce, not only their names, but the tribes they were from and all of the products that they represented. And I, let's say, made a balls up of it, proper. And there were some very disappointed looks from these people. And I've been thinking and dwelling about it. Where is the opportunity for us to learn and embrace for free? I've been presented with a lot of $400 days to attend, to understand our Māori culture, to become closer to the term of kaitiakitanga, to taitao. Sorry, see, there you go. I'm sorry. I just want to make that point clear, that we are all trying collectively as an industry to embrace this. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. I actively try my absolute hardest to be better at pronunciation and appreciation of our Māori culture, which will in turn position us as our point of differentiation on the world stage. But are we supporting ourselves internally, not just our young, our old? Do you believe that it should be compulsory? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And of course, over the next couple of days, I'm going to try some more words. And I know that our international international listeners and viewers do enjoy hearing a little bit about this. Now, Joel is sitting in the producer booth, aka Sarah's dining room. Joel, what about Gaelic? I mean, is there Gaelic and Irish, English on all your products? Say, for instance, your street signs, I know, around Ireland.
Yeah, so bit of a contentious one. It depends what part of Ireland you're in. If you're in Northern Ireland, where I'm from, there wouldn't be so much Gaelic about. You won't see it on street signs. You'll maybe see it in some businesses and stuff like that, but that's a whole other thing. But if you're down south, it's on all the road signs. It's pretty much everywhere. And they learn it in schools. I think it's compulsory up to a certain age. And yeah, it is. It's a pretty big thing. Like, most people can speak some Gaelic. Because I'm from the north, I'm hopeless at it. I took like 2 weeks of Gaelic, and I'm shocking at it, so I won't even try.
So what's your opinion then? Obviously, similar to me, I wasn't brought up with it. Now I'm in those positions where I do need to appreciate and acknowledge that language.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I quite like the history of it, and being, Irish. I think it is a big part of my past. So I really like the idea of learning Gaelic, and I quite like having it around, and it makes it feel more like, it's an actual country that isn't just, a general country around the world. It's a bit of culture. But I don't know, that's my take on it. Isn't
there a contest for the longest place name is in Ireland versus the longest place name in New Zealand?
Oh, no, you're thinking of Wales.
Wales.
Wales have some great place names that are like ridiculously long. Yeah. Also, same with the steepest hill, because there's that one in Dunedin, isn't it?
Yeah. It's out. It's kind of like Australia trying to take Shrek the sheep away from us, and that is another story. Now, turning to the stories that we have for you tonight. After 7:20, Chair of the Freshwater Leaders Group, John Leyland-Peno, is going to join us in an article from this week's Farmers Weekly, and of course on your front page around Minister David Parker's saying the rules are the rules. John was the chair of this Freshwater Leaders Group, so I have some questions I put to him in a pre-recorded interview from earlier today about his thoughts that these rules are going to have little impact on those meeting the high environmental standards already, calling the farmers that aren't laggards. Now, close to $200 million is at risk in our live export income towards the end of the year, as Minister for Agriculture Damien O'Connor seeks safety assurance for New Zealand's live cattle export trade, following this sad maritime event that lost the lives of many and, of course, thousands of cattle. After 7:30, retired Hunterville vet Jim Edwards is now the chair of the Animal Trade Advisory Council, and he's going to join us to explain where we are as of today on the current situation. To close the show, we're going to discuss hemp. A new report commissioned by New Zealand Hemp Industries Association and funded by AgMart. Dr Nick Marsh believes hemp could be another export crop success comparable to our wine and our kiwifruit, worth $2 billion and could supply 20,000 jobs by 2030. But there are some barriers, and we discuss that with Nick towards the end of the show. But first up on the show, the privilege to be joined by former Trade Minister Tim Groser, who was at the coalface of a lot of New Zealand's successful trade negotiations in the past. Following a recent webinar with NZX Dairy Derivatives, Tim explained that his fear is the rise of food nationalism, and it should be of grave concern to New Zealand, whose overwhelmingly exports majority of our food production. Tim is going to join us next on Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country. Well, during an NZX dairy derivatives webinar held recently on opportunities for the dairy industry in the dynamic landscape of world trade, former Trade Minister Tim Groser believes dairy prices and exports have fared well amid increasing problems for world trade, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, outlined in a story by Hugh Stringelman for Farmers Weekly, the rise of food nationalism was of grave concern to him because New Zealand overwhelmingly exports its food production. And Tim joins us now. Good evening, Tim.
Good evening.
Now, as your Director of International Affairs for Agriculture and Rural Development for the European Commission, John Clark, was on that webinar. He commented, and it stood out to me, that the world trade is in its biggest crisis for 25 years, this US-China at loggerheads, and of course, the WTO is starting to lose, what feels like it's losing its might and starved of funds. How concerned are you for New Zealand's position to fight for fair trade and our trade agreements to be upheld post-COVID?
Well, I'm concerned about a number of the things you've mentioned, Sarah, and we could go into any of them in any depth you want. But I actually believe New Zealand is quite well placed as a result of what has been done over the last 20 to 30 years. So we've got a number of trade agreements that stand alongside, but essentially separate from the WTO, that give New Zealand exporters a fantastic degree of protection. We are the only country apart from, well, in fact, if you include Hong Kong, we're the only country to have separate free trade agreements with all three constituent parts of the Chinese economic space. That's China mainland itself, the most important by far. I supervised the negotiation in 2009 of a comparable agreement for Hong Kong, Macau, and then facilitated politically the negotiation with Taiwan, which, were it a separate country, we don't recognize Taiwan because of our one China policy, would be the 20th economy in the world. And we've got free trade agreements that are fully phased in for the most part, and they're going gangbusters. So actually, we've got a fair degree of protection. I'm not trying to sound as if I'm not concerned about these other issues, but it's not time to run for the exit doors, Sarah.
Okay, let's talk about the current negotiations on the table, and that is with post-Brexit, the UK and Europe, again fighting over a quota split, and particularly in our red meat. And Tim, we've exported some of our best trade negotiators to the other team as well.
Well, I'm the person who negotiated those original deals back in 1994 at the end of the, or 93 at the end of the Uruguay round, when I was New Zealand's chief negotiator. This is before I disturbingly got a rush of blood to the head and went into politics. So those are still in place. Now, Brexit has complicated those arrangements, and yes, there will have to be some type of negotiation to distribute the gains across the two now separate customs territory when legally Britain finally departs from the European Union. And of course, we're all watching to see if the British government is actually committed to developing a trade agreement with the EU. At the moment, it looks very dodgy. So yes, there are problems in it, but we have negotiators who are fully engaged on the matter, who know what they're doing, and they have a baseline, the Uruguay round commitments, which, you know, I negotiated at the time. And they're still intact. The sheep meat agreement's still extremely important for New Zealand. And while we're just looking at that, you know, if for some, I mean, China's gone through the roof in terms of our sheep meat exports in recent years. And we have underfilled the 228,000 approximately metric ton quota for sheep meat imports into Europe duty-free. But were China to go south for some reason, there is still access there that distributes our risk. So while these things are disturbing and troubling, New Zealand farmers and the people whose economies and families depend on their efforts should feel that we're in a much more secure position than we were, say, 30 years ago.
Yes, however, we have had a thing called COVID, and there's been a real shift in regards to food service, and they're moving very quickly to find markets in e-commerce and, of course, into retail. So regardless of trade agreements, we're not feeling that in terms of price back here behind the farm gate yet.
Oh, you're absolutely right. So let's just quickly go through that issue. First of all, the most important impact is the overall macroeconomic impact on global economic growth. And this has been a freaking disaster. I mean, you can't put it any other way. This is the greatest decline since the Great Depression, far more sharp than the GFC 10 years ago. But it has been masked so far by the most extraordinarily accommodative monetary and fiscal policies of the major players. Now, you sit back and scratch your head. How long can this go on? And that's linked to something that nobody can give us an answer as to how long is this pandemic going to go on? Because if this goes on for another 2 years, people run out of financial ammunition. So we still can't really put a number on the biggest issue of all, which is the macroeconomic impact. With respect to our services exports, this has been an unmitigated disaster. I mean, basically has eliminated $5 billion of tourism earnings and around about, what depends how you count it, it's more than 5 billion in tourism. It's a much larger figure than that, but it's gone out of my mind at the moment. It's around 4 to 5 billion in education. So, I mean, this has been a disaster for our services exporters, and that feeds through into all of our communities, including rural communities, which are not immune from the tourist downturn. But with agriculture's held up pretty well, as we were having that discussion you referred to earlier. Basically, food prices have gone a little bit positive, as supplies have become constrained. So the really negative stuff is not so much on our agriculture exports, which are around about 2/3 of our exports of goods.
Okay, so I want to talk about this term gastro-nationalism, because it's all well and good relying on the primary sector, but if our markets that we sell to become very insular in terms of their food security and, of course, their patriotism to their own products, I mean, that doesn't position New Zealand well, does it?
This issue of food security has been around New Zealand trade policy now for 70 years since the war. And it was a massive problem, which we made some real inroads into it in the last successful multilateral round, the Uruguay round. Now, it's called different names, but the fundamental phenomenon is the same. It is the wish of governments to protect their farmers from price competition and from imports. And that takes different forms. I mean, I've got no problem intrinsically with the idea of food nationalism, celebrating people's national food stuff, salt cod from Portugal, haggis in Scotland, and so on and so forth. But I would argue the bigger picture actually is the internationalization of those food cultures. So you can walk down Auckland or Wellington main streets and you'll see office workers in their droves going into sushi bars. Simply didn't happen 30 years ago. So I'm not so worried about that sort of nationalistic tendency. What I'm worried about, will it spill over into anti-agricultural trade policies? And the answer to that is that's a constant danger, but we've got a number of defenses in place, as we were discussing 5 minutes ago.
Okay, so obviously in terms of self-sufficiency of a lot of countries, they don't have the ability to be and will continue to rely on New Zealand. However, you've just raised a very valid point there, Tim, in that New Zealand hasn't defined its own cuisine to be able to internationalise it and ensure that we can protect that brand New Zealand.
Well, if we did, the Aussies would steal it. To look at the pavlova. Look, I actually think I'm a great foodie myself and a keen amateur cook. I think there is a New Zealand style of cuisine emerging, but it's more like Pacific Rim. It's not so distinctively New Zealand. It's a style you can recognize on the West Coast. I'm talking about California, in Vancouver, in Sydney, in Brisbane. And we're sort of part of that fusion. It's got a lot of Asian content into it, and it's got fusion with traditional continental European cuisine. I don't think we need to develop a distinctively Kiwi cuisine. Personally, I think we'll just use our wonderful ingredients and let our brilliant, innovative chefs adjust to those trends, as they have done so remarkably over the last 5 or 10 years. Look, Sarah, I've spent most of my life outside New Zealand, representing New Zealand. And I remember, this is a pretty common story, But 40 years ago, New Zealand food was just CRAP, frankly. Nowadays, I think you could walk into some of our modern restaurants and think they're among the best in the world for this. I'm not talking about so much the fine dining, high-end, formal silver service stuff. I'm talking about the younger people with their more informal, casual restaurants. I think New Zealand's as good as anyone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I've got a couple more things I want to cover off with you. It's a privilege to have you on. Thank you so much, Tim. And particularly is around how trade doesn't seem to be a big topic going into this election yet as a huge part of our economic recovery. Former National Party Trade Minister yourself, where do you think the parties lie in their differences on that focus on trade?
Well, I'm absolutely delighted that there are no important differences on trade policy, because New Zealand actually needs a coherent policy that survives the swing of the electoral cycle. And one of the great strengths behind New Zealand, given that we are a small country with limited political power, obviously, has been that both the two major parties that have run New Zealand over the last 70 or so years have fundamentally, since 1978-79, when we started to liberalise first with Australia only, bought onto the same underlying principles. Look, it's got wobbly at times. I was uncomfortable when the Labour Party, then in opposition, mapped out an anti-TPP position for reasons that we could talk about, but it's largely historical. When they came into power, to their credit, they spun on a dime and then repositioned themselves in a pro-trade position, which they historically had been. So, I mean, they got speed wobbles. I can imagine why. But at the end of the day, they came back to the core centre position, which is, in my opinion, the only rational position for New Zealand to take, which is to support pro-trade policies. End of story.
And lastly, how do you feel about the likes of Air New Zealand having to claw back its losses from the lack of international travel by hiking up freight costs to our high-value exporters?
Well, let the markets work that through. Do I like it? No, but I like even less the idea of Air New Zealand collapsing. So, I mean, if we had, there are precious few airlines which under pressure would service New Zealand. So I'd urge people to, just reflect on what the bigger picture here is. Air New Zealand is a vital part of our infrastructure that keeps us connected for physical goods. And we have got a bigger interest in making sure that Air New Zealand doesn't go bankrupt and completely belly up. So I think there is another side to the story.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Tim Groser, former Trade Minister and, of course, trade expert over many, many decades. Wonderful to have him on the show to discuss the article about food nationalism, a threat from this pandemic globally. Now, coming up after the break, we're going to be talking to retired vet, but now chair of the Animal Trade Advisory Council, Jim Edwards, on where we are at with the threat. Nearly $200 million could be lost from live cattle export trades being shut down after this very sad situation that we have had with the loss of this boat. Jim Edwards will be joining us next on Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop for the things you need to live out here.
like electric fencing,
or horse feed,
or bee suits,
children's
chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this.
But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help you farm,
grow, milk, dredge.
rear, come on in.
Because we're out here too.
If you've just joined us, kia ora and welcome to Sarah's Country. Of course, if you were here with us at the start, we are talking about the fact it is Māori Language Week, and you would have heard my introduction around my struggles growing up, as I say, as South Island sheltered Pākehā when it comes to having that education and background in speaking te reo. And I try my absolute best with my pronunciation and the inclusion in it because I strongly believe that it is a part of our future. However, we need the support mechanisms around us to be able to come on this journey together. I asked for your comments and what your thoughts were. Thank you so much for coming through. Good on you for trying to use te reo from Andrew Kendall. Don't think it should be compulsory at schools, but there should be an option to learn. And Anthony believes that it's time for us to come as one and use English as we're meant to, as a team of 5 million and 2 different teams. And Michael believes our core team is Māori. English is historically our second language. So some interesting comments coming in, and I absolutely love this one from Joe Wood. Pulling me up on the pronunciation of the word pronunciation, that I should have the non in there, not noun. It's not pronunciation, nonciation. Joe, I wish my parents had more foresight into what my career was going to be, that they enrolled me in speech and drama. I come from a terrible accent and I roll my R's, etc., etc. How on earth I knew I was going to end up being in this broadcasting role? I do apologise and I seek to be better in the future. Thank you so much for sending through all of your comments. Now, I also, just before we go to our next guest, would love to read out, as I say, we do have a Northern Hemisphere listener base. It's absolutely real. And one particular email that's come in, if you'd like to email me, I've changed it to Sarah, really easy now, sarah@sarahscountry.com. Now, Sarah has an H, or H, Australians say, pronunciation. Ian McDermott, hopefully I've got that right, wrote to say that really loves the show. And this is with regards to the rural contractors seeking to be able to get migrants, very valuable, highly skilled migrants here for the season to drive our tractors. Now, Ian has done multiple seasons working in Southland. He says, as far as first-hand experience, you can probably teach the basics to a lot of New Zealanders to drive these machines, but what they're missing the point on is it's when you get into that steep land and all it takes is a shower of rain and the ground turns greasy really quickly, that things can turn very ugly. And you have to learn how to adapt quick and give guidance to fellow members of your team so that they can all go home safe at night. And that only comes with years of experience, particularly around the maintenance side of the technology has evolved so much as well that it's hard to keep up. And he's been working around forage harvesters for almost 20 years and enjoyed his seasons working with the contractors in Southland. Now, for a shout out, they're in their 4th and 5th cuts of silage in sunny Scotland. Please send us your emails. I love hearing from our viewers, and I certainly heard from a lot in the weekend when I got to watch Sideline of Counties versus Hunterville. It was great. Okay, now turning to our next guest in Farmers Weekly, a story from Annette Scott around MPI putting an immediate halt to the live export of cattle. And this is after the tragedy of the sinking of Gulf Livestock 1 in the typhoon of Masca off the coast of Japan. Joining us now is the chair of the Animal Trade Advisory Council, Jim Edwards. Jim, whereabouts, can we just set the scene a little bit, I suppose, in regards to the live export market in the first part of the year leading into this, and how much it has affected the industry to have been put at a massive halt, and of course respect for those who have lost their lives?
Thank you for inviting me, Sarah. It's certainly been a growing trade, and so far this year, since the beginning of lockdown, in fact, there's been about $100 million worth of income come into the rural communities, and these animals have come from maybe about 2,000 farmers. So there's been a spread of that fresh income coming in, which will then multiply as it's circulated around the economy. But this maritime tragedy has really affected it, and the ministry has put a suspension on the trade.
Ray Smith, and of course Damien O'Connor has been publicly on the record of wanting to review live animal exports prior to this tragedy. So how did that current review exacerbate into where we are today?
The review into livestock exports was initiated in the middle of last year, and so there were some workshops, and the ministry people have been away looking at that. But unfortunately, as yet, we have not seen the results of the review, and it's apparent we may not see that until after the election.
Let's talk about, I know I do have to have full respect for the people involved in this particular tragedy. I just do need to talk about the flow-on effect, and I'd like to understand around some of those liabilities for our audience who have been involved in that trade and those who have been caught up along the process, and particularly that quarantine. How is that affecting, and where does that liability lie when a halt is brought in so suddenly like this?
Well, everything is effectively on hold while this trade is suspended. And so currently there's just over 25,000 animals sitting in pre-export isolation, and some of those farmers will have already been paid, others will be paid later as the letters of credit are activated as the exports do proceed across the border.
Okay, so say for instance that money doesn't come through, what sort of legalities are around this for some farmers who are fearful about getting paid when so a review could take a long time? We know how long government can take on most things.
Well, there's two things we need to think about with the review. There's clearly going to be a maritime investigation that is going to take quite some time, and that's really going to be driven from overseas, but New Zealand and Australia are both very interested parties in that. Alongside of that, we've now initiated a working group with MPI. So we've been working and communicating strongly with MPI since this event. And today, actually, we had the first meeting of that working group where we're looking at what are the assurances, the additional assurances that can be provided so that MPI is comfortable to issue the animal welfare export certificates, and hopefully these exports can proceed.
And in your role, Jim, what type of advice can you give when there can be an outside freak situation like it has happened, and we don't know and we will not speculate around what did happen in this particular case? How do you give assurance to ensure that this trade can continue?
We have a long history of exports of cattle from the country, at least 25 years, and they have performed well. And you can actually see the results of the more recent exports on the MPI website where they are now published. So we can give the assurance that this trade does perform strongly, the animal welfare is managed very well, the animals arrive generally in good condition. And so we can also show that the ships that have been involved and the other ships that may still be involved are actually safe ships to be sailing. But clearly, we're working with MPI to help them with the additional assurances that they're looking around the safety of the ships for the animals and, of course, for the people too.
About live animals and the wide
around about 2009, and what it does is bring in a quarterly forum, so 4 times a year we meet and bring in the importers and exporters of animals and embryos and semen, and we also bring in the Ministry for Primary Industry staff that we work with or that these people interface with, and we also have involvement from the laboratories and the other service agencies such as Assure Quality, which are providing a lot of the resources used to make exports happen.
Okay, and lastly, I'm just looking here in Annette Scott's article. The next ship is due, and this was next 10 days. So, of course, that was last week. It's getting closer. A consignment of 14,000 cattle. What happens if this does continue? Do we have the ability to continue to keep these cattle in quarantine, or will they flood the store market, or will they backlog our processes? What's the worst case scenario, Jim, that we're trying to avoid?
the first point is that these animals are being well provided for in the pre-export isolation premises around the country, and so they can be kept there. The food supplies are good, the conditions are good out there, so the animals, in fact, can stay there longer, but it has a significant cost, and that's around about $5 per head per day, which is a lot of money to keep these animals going. Now, it's not necessarily the first time that PEI, as we call it, has been extended. I mean, it depends sometimes on how close the ship is and whether it's a day or so late. So it can be extended. So the important thing is that we then look at, well, the preferred option by far is that these animals are permitted to go for export. So each of the 4 consignments that are sitting there at the moment, really the strong preferences and the best outcome is for those to be exported. Okay, the review will continue on. The suspension otherwise might continue, but the important thing is that's the best option for those animals.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Jim Edwards is the chair of the Animal Trade Advisory Group. And Jim, you know, our thoughts are collectively with you and the community around that at this very tragic time. And sorry to ask such sort of hard-nosed questions when it comes to financials and flow-on effects, because the loss of life is huge and an absolute maritime tragedy. So our thoughts are with all the family around and wider colleagues and industry around that. I do need to make sure I do make that very, very clear. Coming up after the break, we're going to continue to talk and will continue on an ongoing basis to discuss freshwater rules, freshwater regulations, what happened in those negotiations with John Leyland-Peno, who was the chair of the Freshwater Leaders Group. He's saying that if you're already a highly performing, environmentally friendly farmer, these rules won't affect you. All that after the break on Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country.
Really pleased we got into this. Thanks for your help, Dave.
It's a good idea, honey. You reckon it'll come out? Cover it in talcum powder, leave it 10 minutes, and you'll be fine. Good call, Dave.
Good call on getting those security cameras, Dave.
You call a new one yet?
Yeah, kind of.
When you've got decisions to make, we'll be there to help you make the right call.
I'd go for those ones, Bob. Yeah, good call.
Did you choose these?
Oh, you know.
For great advice and insurance, talk to FMG.
Well, he chaired the Freshwater Leaders Group, and he says that these new freshwater rules are designed to lift the performance of laggards and should have little effect on those already meeting high environmental standards. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments wherever you are watching below. John Leyland-Peno, former founder of Synlait, chaired this group around the initial stages of the policy's development and joins us now. Good evening, John.
Good evening, Sarah.
Now, laggards, do you really strongly believe that New Zealand's farmers are ready, in a position and able to implement these freshwater rules so quickly?
Look, I think there's a lot of the things in the rules have been things that the best farmers out there have been doing for a long time and working towards them. And you know, that's been part of the debate. I think that some don't see the need for the rules because they have shifted so far. They've done so much over the last decades. Personally, I think these rules are targeted at those who have chosen or haven't been in a position to move, and I guess time is up on some of those practices.
Of course, we speak a lot to the sustainability team at Synlait and in your former role, and they believe that the freshwater environment plans that have been in place, particularly across both Fonterra and Synlait, will be able to adapt, and there has been a lot of work done. However, do you believe you were in the position of negotiating and providing advice to the government that they shouldn't have been in a position to have to amend post the release of these standards? I mean, should they have listened, they wouldn't have had to amend.
Look, it was for a start. The role of the Freshwater Leaders Group and that I chaired was to work with the officials as they worked through to meet the objectives that the ministers laid down for them. But it was more than that. The whole program was really the last piece of work that came out of the Land and Water Forum work that had gone on for a decade before. And that work had been very broadly consulted on. It had a huge range of interest groups involved, farmers, NGOs, the industry leadership groups, and they had come up with a plan. And most of the things that are being implemented as part of this package were those things that hadn't yet been implemented at the end of that process. So there's nothing new in any of this. I guess where it got difficult, though, or where it is difficult, is for the officials to take some of the concepts, some of the things that I think a wide number of New Zealanders and quite a number of farmers who I'm talking to do believe it's time were put in place. It is difficult to craft them into regulations that are going to be rolled out nationally in a way that is going to be fair for all. And for those officials, as they're drafting up the regulations, to think about all of the various permutations in the various regions across New Zealand. And I for one am pleased that the government has continued to listen right until the end. And I hope that they continue to amend these regulations as they're rolled out and put into practice, because it's the outcomes that we want. It's not a set of rules. It is the freshwater outcomes that are so important for our future, both as farmers and a country.
Yeah, but is it really in terms of outcomes? Because we had such an output-based system that for the last decade we were working to improve. Now we effectively are having a rule book on how to farm. It's actually been moving for some time, and I for one would much rather have an outcome-based system where farmers are given freedom to work towards the outcomes that, the freshwater outcomes or the air quality outcomes or whatever the environmental standard we're trying to achieve is. Farmers have got to have the flexibility to innovate, to change, to adapt, and get the outcome that is required. The problem is that the outcome-based system that we worked to for so long, the leading farmers were moving, they were changing, they were improving. But on every river, every catchment up and down New Zealand, every farmer group that I talk to can point to those on that catchment who have not been doing what they should. And really, they're letting everyone else down on that catchment. And more than that, the leading farmers are starting to pay for the poor practice of others. And I think that's where I strongly believe that it really is time to put some things in place so that those who need to catch up. Okay, so you're saying that you've had the carrot for long enough, now it's time for a stick.
That's one way of putting it. But the carrots are still there. The carrots are increasingly there from industry groups, from commercial enterprises like Synlait, like Fonterra. We've just seen them very recently put in a carrot-based system, but it's a carrot and stick. We're not moving to a stick-based system. We're providing some tools to allow those who need to catch up to be, encouraged, forced to catch up where they need to.
I'd love to ask your opinion around communication style to bring forth the laggards, you call them, with you, because there's a lot of defensive talk. Listened to an interview recently with Minister David Parker. He has a lot of fair points about sediment runoff in Otago and Southland. However, how do you bring people along when they have had a very you'll do as you're told communication style?
Yeah, well, look, I guess that's why I'm definitely not a politician, and I don't aspire to be a politician. There's been a lot of encouraging talk and trying to make sure people understand outcomes, for a very long time. But once, I think that, one of the things that I saw as part of that group, remembering our group we had some leading farmers sitting around the table, we had some academic people sitting around the table, we also had some NGO groups sitting around the table. And what I found increasingly as our process went on is the vast majority of things, we actually agreed on the outcomes that we were trying to achieve. And that was exactly the same with the Land and Water Forum. For 10 years, everyone agreed on where we had to get to. The problem was that, I guess, in the farming community, we're very defensive of those who perhaps haven't moved in the way that they should. And while in the farming community we see some of the communication style of the political leaders as being a bit, blunt, there's a big part of the community who want our politicians to be blunt with those farmers who haven't been moving.
So when do you believe we will understand what it is to have a social licence to operate in this country?
Well, actually, I formed the view through this process that it was really important to get this settled now. There had been a lot of loose ends left at the end of the Land and Water Forum process. Not everything that they'd recommended had been put into place, and farmers need certainty. Farmers have had uncertainty in this space for quite a long time. The Freshwater National Policy Statement first came out. The first one was done in 2011. It was amended in 2014, again a couple of years later. When things are moving like that, it's very, very difficult for regional councils and then farmers to get a clear view of what the expectations are for the future and make decisions accordingly. So I think one of the good things that is happening at the moment, we may not like all the rules, we may not like everything that's happening, but it is providing some certainty that we haven't had for some time.
Do you know who also doesn't like a lot of this too is the financiers, the bank managers and the accountants around this. I mean, I know that your background is heavily in dairy, John, but there's a lot of sheep and beef properties which are looking down the barrel of fencing off any waterway larger than 1 metre and putting in stock water systems, which will literally see them sell up because it won't be viable to farm in our high country. What is the most efficient use of turning low quality feed into protein, and of course the finances don't really stack up on a lot of these places. I know there's a bit of research going on this week with Farmers Weekly team into some of those costs. Eye-watering, especially where on this low slope. How do you achieve profitability and sustainability in the same sentence?
Well, look, our strong advice to the government, and actually I think, I read some of these things and I hear some of these things, and I've talked to farmers in recent weeks who are concerned about some of this. And I think this will come down to the interpretation of how these rules are played out. And I hope that the ministers continue to provide strong guidance to this. As I understand it, the only sheep and beef farmers who will really need to fence off these waterways are either those on low slope who are farming intensively and really should have been fencing waterways a long time ago. There's a lot of beef land out there that is farmed as intensively as dairy that doesn't have animals fenced. And, I'm in a position where we've just bought a farm and I can look at what's happening. One of the farms doesn't even have a water supply system. There's been intensive wintering of beef stock on that farm where they're drinking directly out of freshwater systems. So it's definitely happening. That should have been done quite a long time ago. Those who are on, look, I do know that there are, the way that the maps are coming out, there are some people who are being classified incorrectly, really, when you look at their slope and the level of intensity of those farms. And if you follow it to the letter of the regulation, they would be caught out. In those situations, I'd encourage those farmers to work closely with the regional councils, get their farm environment plans done and show how they're going to manage those risks. I don't think the intent here is to force people to be fencing waterways that really it doesn't make any sense to be fencing because of the low level of intensity of farming around them, and therefore it's really not going to have any impact. And so I think that I know people are worried as they read the sort of the letter of the regulations. My hope at this point, and we had a lot of discussion with their officials as they were putting this in place. My hope is that the regional councils will be sensible with it and that they'll get strong direction from Wellington that that needs to be the case. Because every farm is different, every situation is different, and it is very difficult to sort of allow this to play out by strict interpretation of these regulations.
Did you give advice about the level of capability on the ground to be able to audit and certify that amount of freshwater environment plans and the pressure on regional council and already stretched the Ministry for the Environment staff, and how this will actually be able to come into force?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very important point, Sarah. In our report, there's quite a big section on capability. Whichever way you look at it, there has to be the right capability in the system to make sure that this isn't full of unintended consequences, really. And we talked quite a lot about ensuring that that capability was built quickly, and that there was capability that could come in and assist in areas or councils or with farmer groups and regions where it was needed. So I think that is a good point, and it is going to require a capability build over time for this to be rolled out sensibly.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. John Leyland-Peno, who was chairing the Freshwater Leaders Group and, of course, providing advice to the government through the negotiations on our new freshwater rules. Coming up to close the show, there's been a report put out by Dr Nick Marsh for the Hemp Association of New Zealand that hemp could set to be a $2 billion industry. We are going to hear from Nick on all of the challenges to get hemp to that point. All of that up next on Sarah's Country. This is Sarah's Country. Now, I would love to know your thoughts on that last interview with John Peno. How do you feel as the chair of the Freshwater Leaders Group? I'd love your comments below. They are already starting to pour in. Duncan said, no, sorry, John. Now the incentive is based on the stick. And another comment, the key to bringing people along is talking with them, not at them. And that kitchen tables is where the key location for that discussion to happen is. So, of course, going from communication into leadership, I'm really looking forward to this next interview. A report has been funded by AgMart and commissioned by the Hemp Industries Association of New Zealand, which has come out to say that we need to unshackle the burgeoning industry, which will be hemp, if we can get rid of our outdated attitude towards it. By 2030, we could have a $2 billion industry with 20,000 jobs attached to the hemp industry. Joining us now is the report's author, industry strategist, Dr Nick Marsh. Good evening, Nick. Now, Nick, let's take a little bit of a step back and set the scene. What position of influence or sort of experience and knowledge did you have about hemp going into this from your previous academic history? But then what similarities did you find when you have emerging success and emerging industries and seeing how hemp is playing out in that direction?
Okay, Sarah, so what I discovered, in fact, it was a chance conversation with a guy sitting next to me on the plane, actually to Wellington one day, a few years ago. And we were talking about what we were doing. And I said, what are you in? And he says, well, I'm looking at hemp. And I said, well, yeah, what's hemp? I had no real clear idea what exactly it was. And he said, you know, I'm captured by this cannabinoids, these molecular compounds in the plant. And I said, never heard of it. And he said, don't you realize that the human body has a system that can listen and be influenced by these cannabinoids in the plant? I said, no. Yeah, they can heal you. They can heal you out of the hemp flowers. There's so many illnesses. And the star is CBD, which I'd never heard of, which reduces inflammation, pain, and stress and anxiety. So blow me down last year, I found myself in Hawaii, we were just on holiday, and I was staggered to see this hemp CBD was everywhere. It was even in the supermarket by the checkout. It was in the gas station. hemp available here, hemp balms, hemp, little bottles of CBD. And I thought to myself, what's going on here? And then I realized that if I bought any of that product in Hawaii and flew back home, strictly speaking, I could be arrested for having drugs, because in New Zealand, we'd define hemp, CBD, which is completely non-psychoactive. It's a healing agent. We'd defined it as an illegal substance. So then when I got back, I started talking to some hemp farmers, in fact, in the South Waikato, and started to discover that there's up to about 150 farmers in last season trying hemp, trying to grow it and see if it could be a new crop for them. And I went to one of the farms, and hectares and hectares of this plant, it wasn't that very high actually, and understood how it worked, and how the whole male and female plants and how the flowers are fertilized and how the flowers actually have the CBD. So I said, I've got to know more about this. And then I found that the association would rather like to have a bit of strategy work done. And they didn't have any money, but I thought, oh, well, maybe I can help out here and do a bit of strategy work. So that's how it all got started.
$65 billion industry, this is in US dollars, by 2030 is the global hemp industry, and we're set to potentially capture $2 billion, but there's quite a few barriers in the way, isn't there? How can we overcome that, and what did your report uncover, Nick?
So just to explain, Sarah, we do have a nice little startup hemp industry in New Zealand. As I said, we've got a number of farmers who've been growing it, and there's a number of companies processing, but they're only allowed to process the seed and the fiber. So most of the plant, they're not allowed to process or touch, and it has to be disposed of, which is ludicrous. Okay. So, and that's where all the cannabinoids are, where in America, it's currently 2019, $1.6 billion market just in the States, but 1.2, which is 75%, is CBD only. So we can't touch the biggest market in the States and in Europe for the sake of no great good reason. And that's really becoming more and more obvious as something that we need to fix. And we need to fix it. The simple reason that we are at economic war, Sarah, as you well know, and as farmers know, as everybody knows, we can't muck around. We can't be stupid at denying ourselves economic benefit by hanging on to laws that actually are completely self-defeating.
How much does this referendum around recreational use of cannabis affect the hemp industry? Because we know when you delve into it, they're not directly connected. However, they are in terms of attitude.
Well, look, I explained to people who most of the people are really quite well not informed about cannabis. The word cannabis, unfortunately, to most people means marijuana. Marijuana is the strain of cannabis that has THC, which is the psychoactive substance. The hemp side of it has the CBD. The other one has THC. So look, if that referendum goes for a yes vote, what will happen is, as has happened in other American states, it will blow up the logjam we've got, because essentially government, whoever the government is going to have to reconsider. They've got medicinal cannabis and a licensing system for that, which is only for prescription medicines. Over here, they've got hemp, a licensing system. And then they've got the illegal economy of the green fairies, which is natural health products made out of marijuana, and obviously the recreational side. And where they've dealt with this in the States, they've just thrown it all up in the air and said, hey, if we're going to legalize marijuana, then we have to start from scratch again and work out the smartest way of doing it. And my argument is very simple, Sarah. Why don't we start with the best thing for economics, for regional economics and job creation? Let's start with that premise, because frankly, most of the cannabinoids are completely harmless. And THC is harmless, actually. Not a lot of people know THC is actually in every one of the medicines. The cannabis medicines has THC in it. So THC is a healing agent, whereas most people think of it as some terrible, wicked thing.
There is feed and therefore traces of THC. This is how distant our education is around the possibility of that. From a food safety perspective, in your report and your research, is that an absolute farce?
Look, I think the issue here is that if you're a regulator, fair enough, your job is to protect safety at all costs, safety of animals, safety of trade. However, there needs to be a voice on the other side, which is about what's best for business growth, for export revenues, for the good of the economy. And I think that balancing act has never really been done, because basically most of the regulation has come out of the Ministry of Health as a health and medicine pharmaceutical argument. So I think that it's time to sort of balance up and sort of look at the greatest interest across all of our interests as a nation. And get a better balance. And I tell you what, Sarah, the Aussies are already moving on this. The Aussies are already looking at this. They have the same sort of laws, but they've actually got a better legal structure. And they are looking at making CBD over the counter in pharmacies legal in early 2021. And if they do that, we would look absurd. So we would be able to go over to Sydney, go to a pharmacy, buy some product, get on the plane and come back here. And what are we going to do? Search our luggage and lock us up? Because it would be illegal here and legal over there. And this is the farce that's going to develop.
Oh, there's a farce going on about those Australians beating us with the Betteslow Cup as well. And of course, some connections could be made, Nick, with who's running the country with regards to COVID, the health versus weighing up the economic benefit as well. So a lot said. However, I want to understand before we close, how did you get to the $2 billion per annum? In theory, what would need to happen for that industry to become to that level?
Well, quite honestly, we looked at it from various angles. There was previous research done, which we weren't able to quote, but previous research done that looked at maybe $1 billion. Look, if you allow New Zealand companies, entrepreneurs, farmers to get on with the job, we are brilliant at how did we put Cloudy Bay in premium position in all the top supermarkets in England some years ago? How did we do that? We're not known for anything to do with Sauvignon Blanc wine, but we did that. Why don't we put our products in premium positions in not only there, but in San Francisco, in Beijing or whatever? We can do this again, but just cut the red tape. Let's get on with it, please.
What an excellent way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Nick Marsh. I believe there'll be a lot of listeners and our viewers that will not disagree with that last comment. And to close, I want to end and summarise around the topics that we've had with Māori Language Week. And I want to thank you for your comments of support that have been coming through, as I have, and I always will be, authentically myself, which is honest, but beyond more than I should. And I have struggled with pronunciation of Te Reo Māori. I try my absolute hardest. I will continue to. But I absolutely do believe in the Te Taiao vision of bringing what is unique to the world, which is our Māori culture around kaitiakitanga, and how we can associate and position ourselves with our uniqueness, our guardianship of our land, our people, and of course a profitable industry that our economy and all can benefit from. So yeah, it's an interesting one that I do experience in rural New Zealand, and I'm going to say we're not that fantastic yet at accepting and bringing this together. So I believe we are one collectively of two languages and of two histories. So it's time to be able to make that a reality. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Sarah's Country, wherever you are on demand around the country, and for those listening live and taking that time out of the evening to join us and, of course, comment live. Sarah's Country is produced in alliance with the fantastic people at Farmers Weekly. And, of course, your newspaper out, hitting your mailboxes today, and, of course, tomorrow in the South Island. If you want to get in touch, sarah@sarahscountry.com. And of course, on podcasts, give us a subscribe and make sure to share with your friends and family. Everywhere I go around the country, I certainly have you coming up and approaching me and telling me that you're listening to it, and I absolutely love it. Thank you. Please send me in your stories, your suggestions for guests and ideas, because Sarah's Country is all about you on the matters that matter most. And let's discuss this with open hearts and open minds, because we have a changing world and we're all in this together. I'm your host, Sarah Perham. It's been an absolute pleasure being with you for the last hour, and of course let's do this all again tomorrow night from 7 o'clock, same place, same time. Until then, good night and go well. This is Sarah's Country.